Hey, good morning, all. Welcome to the Common Good Podcast. It is Wednesday, April 28th, and on Wednesdays, we get to talk a little bit of faith and the common good. It's joined with our regular cast of characters here on these Wednesdays. I'm Doug Paget in Minneapolis, standing up today. Let us know in the chat, if you're watching online, where it is that you're coming from, where it is that you're standing or sitting, and what it is you're doing. And we're going to be talking about faith and sport today. And we'll talk more about, if we are our different commitments and understandings of sports, but how these come together in our call for a common good world and a common good faith. But joined, as always, by Stephanie Spalding and Dominique and Laura. So, hey, Stephanie.
Hello, Doug. Good morning. It's good to see you after a few hours from last night.
We were just on.
Am exactly excited to be here. Another Wednesday, Faith Wednesday. I'm Reverend Dr. Stephanie Rose Spalding, pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Colorado Springs. I am definitely sitting right now, but I'm still closing all my rings on this, wonderful device if they ever wanted to sponsor this show.
Laura Truax. I'm in Chicago, Illinois. I'm the pastor at LaSalle Street Church, and glad to be with you. I am sitting today on a day that dropped 35 degrees in 12 hours, and only that way that the Midwest can, right? It's
that's right.
Chilly day here in Chicago.
And Dominique Gilliard, excited to have Laura back with us this week. Today I'm feeling good. I'll probably talk more today because we have so many sports enthusiasts on the panel with me. And so you'll probably hear from me a lot more today, but I think I'm sitting a little bit with kind of some of the great crowd of witnesses today. We lost a really pillar in the faith yesterday with Dr. Renee Padilla. And then today is the 2-year anniversary of Dr. James Cone's passing. And so just sitting with kind of the wisdom and the legacy that both of those men invested in the faith and kind of relishing the lessons that I've learned from them personally.
Mm.
Well, thank you for that reminder, Dominique. And I didn't know that about
Renee
Padilla. Yeah, I didn't know that. That's it's important news, and he had a fabulous life and legacy. All right, so today we've decided that it's springtime. Baseball is in session. People are constantly talking about sports. The Olympics are up and coming. The youth sports. I mean, sports in America.
NFL draft is tomorrow.
Is that right?
Oh, wow.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you can tell that one of us knows more about sports than the other three. And the relationship in American culture to sports, there's almost nothing quite as powerful as the in setting an identity for people as sports. Like it crosses a lot of boundaries, does a lot of things. I was a college basketball player and was heavily involved in sports at certain times in my life. My later adult life, don't follow it at all. I don't really pay attention, not for any real great reason. Just I think it's been replaced by other concerns and interests and passions, and I just don't find it to be all that interesting. But so many people really do. And one of the questions is there some way that we should think about our own faith, our own culture, and what do we do and how do we connect with sports? I'll just say that as a pastor and as a youth pastor back 30 years ago, boy, there was a lot of competition between the church and sports, especially youth sports. I don't know if you all had that same experience, but
absolutely.
When they started letting kids have like sporting activities on Wednesdays, and that was supposed to be church night, at least here in the Midwest in Minnesota, there were meetings that went on about that. Like this is church time. This is not sports time. And all of that was alive and well. And then, of course, the professional sports are so powerful. I reflect on the fact that race and sports and religion have this connection together. As a child, the number of African American people that I knew the names of and would recognize their faces almost all came from sports. They were the heroes in my life. They were the people I paid attention to. It created an avenue that just, as a 10-year-old, 12-year-old, 14-year-old, got just outside the small group of especially African-American people I knew in the apartment complex that I lived in. But so sports had this like window into a broader world that seemed really exciting. And now I kind of feel the opposite about it. I feel like I don't want to spend my time gazing through that window into sports. So I have this conflicted relationship with sport and in our society and our spirituality and all. How about the rest of you? How do you take this? How do you take this issue?
I have a really interesting personal story about my relationship to sport. Actually, I have a lot, and they are definitely the butt of a lot of family gathering jokes, but we're not going to deal with all of those this morning. For me, it again, I am probably one of the least athletic persons in my family, right? Like, I promise you, my sister's dog is more athletic than I am. It's just not what if speed reading were a sport, then I'm your girl, right? So as a kid, I was not necessarily inclined to paying attention or anything like that, because I just wasn't, I wasn't really coordinated. Even when we played kickball, like I said, I am the butt of a lot of jokes. It was just like, okay, come on, baby, we go. You get to play, but come on, sweetheart. But for our congregation growing up, sports was a way in some instances, it wasn't the only thing, but it was one way to keep young people engaged and active. And so what I value and appreciate about my community growing up was we were a very close-knit congregation, non-denominational, that most of us lived in the same neighborhood. And so most of us did almost everything together throughout the summer, throughout the week, or what have you. And because we all lived in the same neighborhood, we also had parents who were actively engaged in community, like the park district, advisory boards, and stuff like that. And one of the baseball leagues was run by a gentleman who attended our church. So almost all of the boys were signed up for baseball, every summer, because again, it was investing in community, investing in the work that others were doing in the church. And I just remember one summer being like 9 years old, going to my mom, and I'm like, I want to play Little League baseball. And everybody, like my mom looking at me like, what? But my thing was like, I was relegated to standing on the sidelines, cheering for my brothers who were like 6 and 10 at the time. And so they were scrappy. They weren't great or what have you, but I had to stand and watch them play each summer and cheer for them. And I was like, that's full of crap. I don't, like I want access to be able to play. And just because I'm a girl doesn't mean that I should not have access. Now, again, I got hit in the eye with a baseball that year. I got like tossed around the field. I was not the best, but I knew even then, like I wanted to be able to have the opportunity to be part of the experience and not just be relegated to say like, well, this is not for girls. So I was like a 9-year-old feminist without the language of feminism, and like people around me had to deal with that.
Yeah, I would say at our church, I remember, I resonate with what Stephanie said. There is this communal captivation with sports, this feeling that we're all part of something bigger. And I, early on in ministry, I preached a sermon about, could Christians in good conscience continue to watch the NFL? And I'll tell you what, you could have heard a pin drop. I could see all the things go up, and especially the men around the sanctuary are like, "What the Blake? Why are you even going in this direction? Preach the gospel!" but of course, what I was thinking about is sports is also a user of people. And at the time I preached that, that connection of concussions and long-term brain damage and early onset dementia and that condition that I've forgotten, whatever it is, that leads to violent outbursts, and it felt like, wait a minute, what's the difference in the Gladiators, right, and NFL? So Dominique, maybe you can tell me, what's the difference? Tell me the difference in those two things.
I'd say the difference is NFL players are getting paid a fortune to sacrifice their bodies, and I think they are agreeing that the fortune and the fame are worth their livelihoods. It's literally laying down their life for this, and so it becomes an idol. And yeah, I think that's a real question. I wrestled with it. Decided to keep watching everything.
Feel like you have to say that with some apology in your voice?
No, I mean, I decided to keep watching, and then everything with our brother Colin Kaepernick happened, and I protested and didn't watch for 2 years, and then got back on the bandwagon. But yeah, no, I had a whole thing I was coming into where I was going to frame this, and you just threw me off, Laura.
I'm sorry. Discount that. Go to your stuff.
No, I mean, I think I appreciate the question. I mean, I think the first time I really reckoned with it was in the book $1 Million Slave, which really frames exactly what you're talking about. I mean, CTE wasn't out yet, but it was basically saying that when you actually look at the process of drafts for professional sports, and, you got people, particularly male athletes, who strip down essentially to their underwear and they display their bodies in something that's very parallel to what would be in the slave auction. They go and perform for what would be parallel to masters who are ultimately going to purchase you and then put you out there to exploit yourself, mostly for their financial gain, because while you're getting a lot of money, you're getting a fraction of what, the owners and these different people are. And so that was the first time I think I really kind of reckoned with what you're raising. And I think really Will Smith's movie was really another time that I really reckoned with it after kind of sitting with CTE, and we were really starting to see a number of stories come out about how this literally deteriorates and damages the brain to the point that you just are not acting out of your centered self because you've been so thoroughly impaired. So I grew up, I played sports since the time I was 4. And I so desperately wanted to play football, but my mom wouldn't let me. And she said, I want you to be able to walk when you're 35. And I was like, you're just, parents, they're just so dramatic. I was like, I know people who play football, they can walk. What are you talking about? So I just, it was a fight in our house. I ended up playing baseball and played all the way through high school, got a college scholarship to go play, but then ended up getting in a really bad car accident where I wasn't able to fulfill my scholarship 3 days before my high school graduation. And the last game we played, we were in the state championship, state tournament, the game before qualifying for the state title, and had this really bad taste in my mouth where somebody who we were playing against, who went on to the major leagues, called me a nigger our last game. And it, to be able to, to end my career kind of like that was a real rough thing for me personally. But, sports was something, this rub that you named, Doug, it was real in my life. I mean, I was a pastor's kid, grew up in the church mob, but I was also a super talented baseball player. And so I was on travel teams to the point that, like, in summers, I remember one summer I played 200 games
Wow.
over the course of the summer. And so we were playing triple hitters, double hitter, like that. Baseball was my life, my identity. And so, yeah, and then we'd have to have the conversations. Well, you can play Sunday, but you can't miss church, but and that kind of stuff. And so those were real conversations. But for me, I think part of the reason why I never kind of deviated away from sports is because I've always seen sports potential to really galvanize the movement and vote for social change. But I also saw it as, like what you were saying, Stephanie, as a way that a lot of parents kept their kids out of stuff that they didn't need to be involved in through actually channeling them into sports. And I saw the way that sports, when done properly, you learned lessons about being a good person, being responsible for yourself, understanding that you aren't this rugged individual, but you actually have to be a part of something bigger than yourself. And so I saw a lot of the good parts of sports too, that I think were able to help me to stay in it. Is it exploitative? Yes. Is it an idol in our society? Yes. Is it something that we spend way too much time invested in? Yes. But are there redeemable parts of sports? I do believe that they are. And I do believe that in this cultural moment we are right now, we wouldn't be here without sports. And so those are some of the tensions, and we can circle back and I can say some more later. But that's really, kind of the thing I think that leads me to kind of where I am. Just knowing the history of activism through sports and the role sports have played, particularly these last couple of years, in helping us to really reckon with some of the things that we've historically tried to sidestep.
Your comments make me recognize that there's at least three major ways that we think about sport. One of them is participation, right? We've all kind of talked a little bits about that, what we do if we're actually participating in a sport. And then that gets really broad, like people that are runners or are bikers or that go skiing or golf, like activities, sporty, physical activities. And then participation in organized athletics and organized sports, I guess even track and field, or what's the one in the Olympics they do up here in Minnesota where they push the little disc on the ice? Curling, like shuffleboard on ice, like all of those, like participating sports. And then there's the fan side of sports, like the spectator side of sports. And there's obviously so many more people who are spectators than are participants, in any particular game or activity. And it almost feels like the real question that some of us have is the role of the spectators in sports, and even sports that are designed as spectator sports. And then that leads to this third way of people being involved, which is the business side, like the economics side that put it together, which isn't only professional sports. It's also these huge, complex business systems, profit and nonprofit systems that run the sports industries, all the way down to kids athletics, AAU, and like there's a whole system of all of this. And sometimes these blend together, right? They and the critiques that we have. And I've wondered, Dominique, from your comments, if like sports might be the noun that we're talking about, but it's our verb as a community that causes the problem. It's how we treat sports. It's how we interact with it. That maybe it's not inherent from now. I think the NFL and the violence of the NFL and the danger that is to the well-being.
That's a different conversation.
That's its own.
Yeah, I'd agree.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
But boy, the rest of this is like, I don't know, if we didn't apply bad human behavior and obsessive behavior and identity forming around the wrong things to sports, I'm pretty sure we'd pick something else. And it seems like humanity has done this its entire time, right? So anyway, it all feels complex to me, and part of what it means to be a person that's alive in this culture that we're in. I think we have to reckon with it at some levels.
And it does feel like, frankly, the spectator piece of it is one that I can get behind in a way that I can't get over the exploitation of the athlete piece. I mean, the spectators, I do think it's kind of cool that wherever you are in the country, if you're from Cleveland, Ohio, you are a Cleveland Browns fan, right? And I also
For
think
better or
it's
worse.
for better or worse, right? Because aren't they always losing? Don't they like always lose?
Except
and-
this year.
Great
They were
baseball
good this year.
And then like the Chicago Cubs, I mean, it was crazy to me when I moved to Chicago, how there are people who literally felt like their ancestors were somehow still intervening in every season, right? For the Chicago Cubs. I mean, it's kind of lovely, frankly, that there is something that crosses all these state borders and economic borders, educational all these groups, right? They're all tailgating together, and they're all doing it wherever they are, clustered in their living rooms around a sports team. Because I randomly grew up in Ohio, or I randomly was born in Chicago, right? So there's something in that that's kind of beautiful. I just don't know where to place that in the midst of all the other ugliness of, and I would say of many professional sports. Okay. And even like the beautiful sport of biking, right? That's been roiled by drug abuse and everything else. So, I would just say professional sports, I think, has got a challenge.
And I don't even think that it's
so.
just for professional sports. I think that there is still something nefarious in the way that I don't want to come off as if there's nothing good that comes out of sports. It definitely is. Like, again, like this sense of community and learning about yourself in the midst of a team, and again, the health and wellness of the body. But it starts so young in the way that we begin the role of exploitation and idolatry and obsession as it is connected to sport. I think about, again, being from Chicago and the Jackie Robinson West baseball team that had its title stripped from them because, people didn't want these Black kids that had won a Little League World Series to be at that level, having won a Little League World Series, and in doing the things that other communities have been doing all the time as it relates to organized sport, and the way that racism showed up. But I think that there's also this ability to not address like the underbelly of how sport articulates in a microcosmic way who we are as a people, right? Who we are in society. Again, organized sports, professional sports being one of the highest places for the trafficking of women, right? And nobody wants to talk about like the human trafficking of women that happens due to the way that we live out what professional sporting looks like in a multitude of levels. Nobody wants to talk about the level of addiction that plays out, the alcoholism and the drug addiction as spectators that play out. Like, the idea that you can't go to a baseball game and not drink a beer, like the level of addiction that people have in relationship to organized sport. So I think that there is something else that is functioning and happening. And even the way, like as Americans, this notion of American exceptionalism. Again, we look at baseball, America's game, quote unquote, and at the end of it, we have a World Series and nobody else is participating. No one else in the world is participating, but some teams that belong to the United States of America, right? Or we look at football and we're the only ones who are talking about football in this way, So like to the rest of the world, it is soccer. But again, like the way in which we shape notions of who we are, I think that is definitely something nefarious that we have not dealt with.
So I think Yeah, I think there are a couple things. I think that there is this very unhealthy way in which kids are formed, particularly talented kids who have the chance of becoming professionals, are formed and pushed to try to make them manifest their full potential. And so I think that there's always a temptation to start juicing or steroids or different things, performance enhancing drugs, all these different things to help you get over the bar. And I think, the way that you're coached, I think about like somebody like Bobby Knight, who is notorious as a coach, and, some of the abusive kind of ways in which he would engage with his players. But I also think, we have to reckon with the fact that so many people start to envision sports as their dream because it's been the one of the only few acceptable realistic ways out for a lot of people, and we have not reckoned with the fact that desire and that misplaced ambition to a degree, and willingness to lay your life down and invest so much of who you are into this is also a byproduct of systemic racism and injustice that we are unwilling to reckon with, and to talk about how it has been so socially acceptable and expected for Black excellence in particular to be manifested out on the field or on the court, but not in courtrooms or as a doctor or a lawyer or these different things. And so in doing that, I think when we talk about and critique, we also have to kind of frame and contextualize kind of what gives rise to some of this in some of our communities, and how really for me, I think two things I want to say that I think are just really beautiful about sports. I think, Laura, you kind of tapped into it a little bit when you were talking about, Chicago, and, just see how the city came alive when that curse was broken. I mean, when the curse was broken, I think about Boston when the curse was broken. When that happens in a city, it is able to bring people together, mobilize, bring this euphoric feeling that I don't think anything else really does. Now, we might have to have a question about why that's true, but it is true. I also think about like when COVID was just hitting, and sports addicts were reeling. I mean, you had folk who were like, cold turkey just cut. And then they released the Last Dance series.
Oh yeah, and I saw it.
A cultural phenomenon. I mean, people coast to coast internationally were enthralled because this was all that they could get access to. Right. So I think it speaks to the power of sports to, again, transcend, but also to bring joy in life. And I don't want to minimize, in the midst of the seriouser matters of sports that we're trying to undergird, I don't want to minimize the joy, the life, the kind of freeness that celebrating sports brings to people. And so when I talked about the fact that I thought about stopping and I actually decided to keep going, honestly, because my life is just so serious in every other respect almost. I needed a place to be able to just enjoy and to not be screwed. Like I'm aware of what's going on, and I tried to take that seriously, but not to the point that I was going to allow it to take something that gives me joy away. And that was the thing that really kept me kind of engaged in the sporting world. And I think part of what allowed me to do that is this kind of counter resistance in the history and legacy of sports. And so I'll just dig into this real quick and we can take it where we go. But when I think about, the role that Joe Louis played in the fight for racial justice and his standing up to Nazi Germany and actually manifesting that this inferior Negro had the ability to overcome and be world champion. When I think about the legacy of somebody like Jackie Robinson, who we know about, but we don't really know, fully the prophetic nature of Jackie. Like most people don't know that, he talked about, I cannot stand and sing the anthem. I cannot salute the flag. I know that I'm a Black man in a white world. And this kind of prophetic resistance we see in, the 68 Olympics, where Tommy Smith and Giancarlo, the Black Power salute. And then the person we don't really talk about is the white man, Peter Norman from Australia, who actually was also a part of the salute in a less obvious way. And we see this kind of intentional resistance and people asking this real question about what does it mean to pledge allegiance to a flag that hasn't pledged allegiance to us? What does it mean for us to reckon with the history and legacy of oppression and poverty and systemic sin in this world and to act as if it's all okay just because we're on the field? No, I don't stop being Black because I'm on the court, because I'm on the field. And if you are going to think that I'm just going to be complicit with this consumer economy without actually provoking you to think critically about this, then you're mistaken. And so the people, the Muhammad Alis who protest and won't fight because they, so I think that history, that legacy, even to, last year, with the NBA's full frontal commitment to Black Lives Matter. And I think about, even the communal investment. I think about like LeBron James and his school and how, and so I think, there is this counter thrust to sports. While there is a bunch of dark and ugly, there is kind of this counter thrust that has really gave a platform for these conversations in a way where honestly the church hasn't been able to in the same way because it has lacked the influence and really the prophetic ability to speak specifically into masculinity in the way that sports has the ability to say that you're going to actually have to reckon with this if you're going to engage in this as a consumer. And so I really have appreciated the way that I think all of the pieces of the puzzle kind of work together in that regard. And I think if it were not for sports, I think this conversation would be a lot further back than what it is actually today.
Can I just, I think that's really interesting, that whole masculinity piece. I read a book a number of years ago about the role of Dwight L. Moody, from Moody Bible Institute, and how he was an important figure in galvanizing evangelical support for sports, that he believed that coming out of World War I, there was a prissiness to the church, and that could only be confronted with a strong presence of masculinity. And so he was one of the early people to make sure that that sports were part of the after school program, right? The Sunday school, the Wednesday night thing. He organized or got people organized around sports leagues, church leagues, and things of that sort. And so, I think evangelicals have really raised the baton on that. Can I just go to one other thing real quick? Dominique.
Jerry Falwell, too. Falwell has the same background and it was very intentional about inserting sport and Christianity in that same way. So.
Yeah. So, the other thing that occurred to me, Dominique, while you were talking is Doug used the language, or maybe Stephanie did too, around how we've made idols, sports as an idol in our culture, and how that's reversed when you get the salute, the Black Power salute, or you get Kaepernick kneeling. They are refusing to say that this sport is my idol, that there is something beyond that. There is a justice issue beyond this. There is a equality. There is an end of oppression, that those are the ideals that transcend this smaller idol of my sports team or my victory or my first place finish, right? So that's a really interesting way. We don't talk about it like that, but we should, right? That these athletes are lifting up something broader than the win. So anyway, I think that's just a really interesting thing for us to recover.
And that is not often seen as a positive, right? There is an entire
Right.
push in our society to be sure that issues like race, economics, gender, violence are not critiqued through sports, right? There's a whole argument that says, let sports
Shut up
be
and dribble.
sports. Shut up
Mhm.
and dribble, stay on the court, all of this.
Right.
And that's a thing that we
Um,
do. This is how power is maintained in our societies. You just tell people that only certain people can have opinions and can express those opinions through their professional vocation, work life. And it's a real power play. I watched a movie last night called One Night in Miami. It's
Great
was
movie.
a drama, a play. It's Muhammad Ali, Malcolm X, Sam Cooke, and Jim Brown. Jim Brown was a football player
Mhm.
that we're all friends, and there's kind of a fictional telling of them in a hotel room one night in Miami in 1964. And these issues, that's not why we're talking about this today. It happened to be that I watched this last night and I haven't stopped thinking about it. Really powerful that through time in our society, and you did a great job, Dominique, of reminding us, from the 1960s forward, how sports brought this in. But this same thing is happening now, right? You see it in high schools. Like yes, high school sports bring a school together, no doubt. But normally it's around one group of people, normally the boys, certainly one sport versus others. Sometimes where I live, it's hockey, or maybe it's football, or occasionally it's baseball. And the rest of the school sort of gathers around to cheer them on. And, occasionally if the whole football team joins a High School Musical, everybody makes a big deal out of it, right? Because it sets up this hierarchy of narrative that just starts to form and to frame in our society. And when someone brings that up, the critique is, well, why do you have to ruin a perfectly good sport? Like, why don't we leave all of these issues to all of these issues? And this is a place where I think people of faith need to engage, right? And one of the things our faith ought to do, it seems to me, especially as Christians, is it should widen our view to allow us to see things we didn't see. If you take the notion from the old song, I was blind and now I see, or you take the parable or the story of Jesus healing the people who are blind so that they could see, our faith should open our eyes to see what's happening. It doesn't mean that sports don't have a role. It means we should see as best we can the totality of when they're harmful and when we can call out those things, because there's no reason sports have to be like that. They don't have to be. These are systems and structures that are in place to try to keep people from raising the larger issues in our societies.
And it's extremely intentional. Which is in part why, to some degree, I'm just not, well, again, I already told you all, I wasn't the most athletic person to begin with. So there's a bias in that, but there are also all these other complex things and the way in which sport is being used, even to the point that both Laura and Dominic raised around masculinity, Christianity, and the rise of Christian nationalism. Like, I have a colleague who does masculinity studies and sport and has talked about how the nation utilized football at the end of World War II, at the end of the Cold War, to actually advance this kind of nationalistic perspective and this masculinist perspective about how we will project ourselves into the world, that we're still in some ways, like in very connected ways, we are dealing with right now as we think about Christian nationalism. Now, I'm not going to get into all of it because it's not my area of expertise, but it is conversation that I know people have invested in. There's a reason why Falwell were like pushing evangelicals into this notion of what plays out in terms of masculinity on these fields, on these courts, so that we can have a projected image in the world about ourselves as a nation. And we have one of our viewers asking the question about the trafficking of women and what does that mean? The Super Bowl is one of the largest sporting events or events period in the United States, in the world, where the amount of women that are trafficked because of how money, capital, how masculinity, how drugs and under culture plays out in these organized institutions, and the exploitation, the expectation to exploit particular kind of bodies in these ways. And I guess for me, it's like, it's not like I don't have the blind eye to turn, right? Like, yes, I do know that there are very valuable things, but at this moment, the people who are corrupted and impacted by the way in which organized sports plays out, we're left in a position for folks to have to protest, right? To Dominic's earlier question, why do we have to have this history of athletes in this way? Because it is a racial history of how Black bodies have been seen. It is the lack of platform in other industries that Black bodies have access to this kind of global platform. And so, again, that still remains in the conversation about how we prop or utilize sports, and the way we don't want to necessarily navigate it. Again, thinking about the U.S. the International Olympic Committee disallowing people to protest, like specifically coming out with rules saying, don't do that. This is not the space for that. We don't want you to have these conversations. And then coming back to the people, why we have to use these platforms in this way, because of a lack of access, because of a lack of way, and I'm excited about the way that the NBA came on board. I'm more excited about the WNBA and how women team, like, they were full force with their support of, absolutely, with their support of Black Lives Matter, and not just Black Lives Matter, but also being directly connected to the impacting, elections and everything, like systemic change, right? Like, I get like the mantra, but where's the systemic work of these organizations? And even with the NFL, taking a pause and stepping into the Black Lives Matter conversation, but not doing retribution to Colin Kaepernick, right? So, and not really changing the way the system functions and operates. So it's that tension for me, again, as an activist, anti-racist, but then also in a matter of faith. Like when I'm preaching in a congregation and people are tapping and hemming and hawing and huffing and puffing because it's Sunday and a football game is on, I'm like, dude, I really don't care. God. I really don't care if Kansas City is playing today, right? But like that real level of idolization that we do have to address.
So I want to bring a little balance and say that I actually think that there actually has been some real accountability and thrust and movement for systemic change that have come out of professional sports the last couple of years. I think particularly with the NBA, if you saw as the election season came up, so many NBA teams used their arenas as voting registration opportunities and really had their professional stars really getting out the vote and actually advocating for the necessity of participating in voter registration. You also saw some NFL players be a part of some important legislation around racial justice in a couple major cities. Think about Philadelphia. I think about New Orleans. So there has been some stuff. That said, I think there is still, again, very dark stuff that we need to be reckoning with and talking about in regards to sports. I think we need to be talking about the legacy and prevalence of sexual assault that's connected to professional sports. I think from everything from, like Deshaun Watson, what's going on right now, major stars being involved, to things like Larry Nassar. So I think like there's these real conversations that we need to be having. We need to be talking about the pay gap and gender inequality with sports. Some people argue that it's all solely based on the revenue that's generated, but there's some deeper stuff that are going on. There are ways in which female professional athletes are barred from participating in the same kind of endorsement deals that men have access to, even in when it's Olympic teams. I think about like particularly women's soccer here in the U.S. The men's soccer teams have not been good. Women's soccer teams have been great, but they haven't been able to leverage their platform in the same way because of certain prohibitions. A great show for people who are interested in understanding the interconnections between kind of justice and sports and race and gender is LeBron James's show, The Shop. That comes on HBO. It's a great show. He's had everybody from Stacey Abrams to, just all of these civic leaders. It's a space where they bring civic leaders and star athletes together to talk about social change and how do we mobilize the people for the common good. It's a great show. I really would highly recommend it. But I think, to your point, Doug, I do think this tension that has emerged from some of what's going on has invited the church to reconsider its engagement with these conversations around what is the role of faith and faith formation for so many of our young people who are Christian athletes. And, you have, the Fellowship of Christian Athletes that emerges and really has some toxic racist roots that we really got to reckon with as we talk about, that whole legacy. But like, as we come into a revelation of some of that, what is the church's role now in reckoning with a more holistic understanding of who we're called to be, particularly as we're forming and shaping people who don't see their primary vocation as within the four walls of the church, but see their vocation as something like athletic or as in the arts. Like, what do we have the imagination to understand what does it mean to intentionally form and shape people in those different arenas for Christ in a way that they have a deep commitment to justice, where they are willing to say, actually, I see this as idolatry and I'm actually not willing to participate in these ways because I understand that it causes me to divide my allegiance and, dare I say, serve two masters. Like, is there a line in which we are helping our people to see that they can't cross and authentically say that they are faithfully following Christ? And I think that's part of the question that's before the church for us right now, I think, with some of these things that are really emerging from some of these conversations about faith and activism in the sporting world.
Yeah, I think that's so right. I think we have failed to actively enter into that conversation. There's so much that we absorb, consume without thinking, without even being aware or trying to untangle those issues, right? And there's a part of me that gets that. Life is complex. And for the love of God, just give me my sports team, okay? Let me just root on Sunday afternoon for my team, right? So even as a minister, when you're trying to untangle these thorny things and you're trying to, and there's plenty of passages in the New Testament. I mean, Paul goes liberally into analogies of the human body, right? I buffet my body. I'm running the distant race. I mean, he clearly has the language of the Greek ideal of the human body, and learning through and speaking of these deep truths through this being that we inhabit, right? So it's not that we don't lack passages from which we can enter into these conversations. It's just that I think we divorce ourselves from it because we're not really aware of, wow, the scariest day to be a woman in America is on Super Bowl Sunday, and that domestic hotline spike, and even the NFL's put out these PSAs over the last few years to to kind of make people more aware of what can happen and keep your temper in place, and the trafficking of women and the exploitation of athletes, and this weird nationalism, like what the national anthem is part of our sports identity. That only happened recently, people. I mean, all these things, right? But it's hard to kind of thread the needle through that. So we just are silent, and we're like, okay, yeah, go watch the game, everybody. Go Bears, right?
Yeah, it feels like there's this tension and temptation for all of us to want some parts of our society, our lives, to be set apart and pristine from all the other struggles, right? Yeah. And whether that's somebody getting into art or entertainment or sports, or for a lot of people, their religion, they actually want their religion to not have to be tied up in all the complexity of the world. They want it to be a comfort. You know, we all pick our comfort and our comfort foods. And we do have to find a way to allow for the space of every engagement that we have in our society to have its own space, and to recognize that it's not unique, and it's not protected from the other cultural forces that all have to be addressed, without all of those issues being dominated by every other cultural issue. Right? This is what gets hard for us as human beings. There's a range of issues that we talk about here a lot, and that we think are really important, from issues of race and economics and gender and the environment and all of this. And so we have to recognize that every part of our society is impacted by those. There's no part of our world that's like free from environmental impact, or is free from gender bias, or is free from economic injustice. So these are all going to be in play. And we shouldn't say that one area of our life doesn't have to talk about them, doesn't have to deal with them. But then also, how do you not let each one of those issues become the dominant issue when someone goes to a concert, or looks at a piece of art, or wants to have a backyard picnic, or goes to a sporting event? Like, how do we integrate issues of righteousness and justice and goodness, and we'd say around here, common good, in a way that is normal and natural, not to dominate every conversation with all of those topics, and also not to exclude any of those conversations from any particular topic. That's a kind of maturity and difficulty that it feels like we could be in our faith communities, in our own individual lives, trying to narrate and trying to curate and trying to bring about. And it feels like that's part of the venture that we're on in whatever this woke sort of moment is, that we find ourselves in our own life development, or in our cultural development.
It certainly is the balancing act. Again, to your point, Doug, takes a lot of maturity. So Dominic, I certainly get, like, look, I just need a place where I can have joy. Do not watch movies with me. I am letting everybody in the listening land know. Again, because being a critical race scholar or what have you, my brother, after The Lion King came out and then it was Avatar, he was like, I'm never watching another film with you in life, because I am that person, Doug. I am like, good God, like, can we talk about the sexism and the colonization and everything? But no, and it's true. It's, again, even as we do this work, we also want the space where the release valve, the pressure valve can be open, right? And we can just be like, that gave me joy, Again, I teach a class on hip hop. Good God, how do you do that as a Christian, right? So, again, these are rich conversations. I just want to point out, again, that our listeners are saying, I've never even thought about sports as a discussion point because I don't watch it. None of this makes sense to me, new knowledge. And it is, right? Like, there's a way to enter into these common good conversations in anything.
Yeah, so I think a lot of what we're talking about is really important. And for folk who are wanting to unpack some of this a little bit more, I think a book we've talked about behind the scenes is Jesus and John Wayne. And she has a whole section about the intentional investment in sports as evangelism strategy, but as an evangelism strategy that will bring people into the church in a way where they weren't going to reckon with all these things, other things that we're talking about that are associated with sports. And so I think there is this deep history and legacy that we have to reckon with in regards to that. But I also think at the same way, I've seen some intentional advancements in sports that I haven't seen in the broader society. And so I think about like how intentional sports has been with trying to reckon with some of this stuff. And so you've seen the increase of female referees. You've seen females actually stepping into front office positions in sporting teams in both baseball and football. So I see, this glass ceiling shattering in some ways in sports, because there is this more honest reckoning with the realities that kind of get sugar-coated. And I think I really want to applaud this emerging generation and this current generation of athletes, because they are taking their social responsibility and the role of activism more seriously than I think historically athletes have. And because of that, I think the broader society is reckoning with these conversations in a different way. And had it not been for stars like LeBron and different folk who were saying like, hey, at the apex of my game, Colin Kaepernick, at the apex of my game, I'm willing to take the stand. It's one thing to take a stance past your heyday and you've won, you got all your money and secured your endorsements, but people at the apex of their vocation, the prime of their lives, willing to take a stand for these things, I think it is a sacrificial commitment that really does bear witness to the common good. And so I really want to affirm these athletes, because one of the reasons why you'll hear some people who take more of an analysis like me and Stephanie, they won't call Michael Jordan the greatest, is because Michael Jordan has some opportunities to actually step up and speak into this, and he didn't want to get in the fray. And so there's been some real critique around him, that and some praise of LeBron. And then you just saw Michael Jordan gave a huge investment to BLM, maybe in part trying to rectify some of that history. But I do want to say, like, it is an intentional sacrifice, and some people have literally lost their vocation because of their commitment to justice. Some people, I was just in the show notes, I include this in the show notes, but it's the story about the first professional basketball player who chose not to stand during the Pledge of Allegiance. He ended up getting his house burnt down. His wife left him. Like, there are real costs that some of these people are paying to make this commitment. And so I just want to affirm that and say we need to be intentionally forming more believers in particular who are willing to pay that countercultural cost.
Yeah, well, friends, we've reached our 2-minute warning here. It's my little sports joke. Coming to an end. Thank you again for a great conversation where we try to ask what the role of our faith is in pursuing the common good in our life and our world and our society. And it's been another great, robust conversation. Thanks, Dominique and Stephanie, Laura, for being part of this Wednesday crowd. Stephanie mentioned earlier that we just finished a 4-week series on the threat of Christian nationalism. That's available on all of our social streams and our YouTube channel and at votecommongood.com. So if you head over there, you can watch all of those. And you also can find all of these live streams and our podcast and a number of our actions and activities, including something we're about to announce more publicly. We'll let all of you know that we're going to bike across the country from San Diego to St. Augustine, Florida, September 10th through November 14th to raise awareness and calling for common good immigration and border practices. So it's going to be an epic ride that will invite you to come on a day, a week, every mile, or host a community ride in your neighborhood, or join us virtually. A whole lot of ways that you can do this to connect with the stories of refugees, asylum seekers, migrants who make we the people of this country, we the people. So some of that's going to be coming to you. All of that's over there at Vote Common Good. And you'll also be reminded that on Thursdays, we talk about issues. We're going to be talking with Diana Butler-Bass tomorrow. We'll talk economics on Friday on this podcast. Monday is news. On Tuesday, it's politics. And that brings us back around to another Faith Day on Wednesdays. So thank you for being a part of all that we have going on here. We really appreciate it. And we will see you all tomorrow.